The snow fell heavy that December morning in 1942, blanketing the streets of Warsaw in a deceptive layer of white that made everything look peaceful, almost serene. But there was nothing peaceful about Warsaw anymore. The ghetto walls rose like tombstones against the grey sky, and behind them hundreds of thousands of people were crammed into a space meant for a fraction of that number. Among them was Jakob Steinberg, a former electrical engineer who had once designed lighting systems for theatres across Europe. Now, at 34 years old, he was just another prisoner in the largest Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe, watching his world shrink day by day. Jakob stood in the corner of the cramped apartment he shared with 11 other people, holding a piece of copper wire he had salvaged from a destroyed building. His fingers, thin and trembling from malnutrition, turned the wire over and over. The apartment was on Mila Street, in a building that had somehow survived the initial bombardments. Through the cracked window, he could see the guard towers, the barbed wire, and beyond them, the city that had once been his home but now felt like another world entirely. If you're finding this story compelling so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these important historical narratives to light. The idea came to Jakob one afternoon when he was watching a group of children in the courtyard below. They were playing with a piece of string, creating a game out of nothing, the way children do even in the darkest circumstances. Their laughter was thin, weak from hunger, but it was still laughter. And then he saw it. One of the children had tied the string between two posts and was using it to pass messages to another child on the opposite side of the courtyard, too weak to walk the distance. It was such a simple thing, but it sparked something in Jakob's engineer mind. Communication, connection. The thing the Nazis wanted most to deny them was the ability to organize, to share information, to maintain hope. Jakob began working that very night. The apartment was silent, except for the sound of breathing, some of it labored and weak. His wife, Rachel, had been dead for 3 months, taken during a routine selection. His daughter, Sarah, just 8 years old, slept fitfully in the corner, her small body curled against the cold. He worked by the light of a single candle, carefully stripping the insulation from the copper wire using a piece of broken glass. His hands remembered the work, even if his body was weak. He had once built systems that brought light to thousands. Now he would build something much smaller, but perhaps just as important. The wire system Jakob designed was brilliantly simple, which is exactly why it worked. Using scavenged telephone wire, electrical wire, even wire from destroyed piano strings, he created a communication network that ran through the walls, under floorboards, through gaps in the brickwork. The Nazis were looking for radio equipment, for weapons, for obvious signs of resistance. They weren't looking for simple wire. Jakob recruited others carefully. Moshe, a former telephone operator who understood connection systems, David, a younger man who still had the strength to climb and install wires in dangerous locations. Esther, a woman who had worked in a telegraph office and could tap out messages faster than anyone Jakob had ever seen. The network grew slowly, cautiously. They ran wire through the basement tunnels that connected several buildings on Mila Street. They used the old sewage pipes as conduits. They threaded wire through holes in walls that had been made by shrapnel and bullets. Each connection point was marked with a simple code, a scratch on the wall that looked like nothing more than damage from the war. Within 3 weeks, they could send simple messages between 6 different buildings. Within 2 months, the network reached 14 locations across the ghetto. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. David would climb through spaces barely wide enough for his emaciated frame, threading wire through gaps in collapsed walls, under floorboards that might give way at any moment, across rooftops where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. Jakob would watch from below, his heart in his throat, as the young man risked his life to extend their communication network another few meters. Every connection mattered. Every new building added to the network meant more people who could receive warnings, share information, coordinate resistance. Moshe developed a system of code taps that could convey complex messages using simple patterns. 3 quick taps meant danger approaching. 2 slow taps, followed by 3 quick ones, meant food distribution. A series of taps in groups of 4 signaled the arrival of news from the outside world. They trained operators in each building, usually women whose smaller hands could work the connections more easily and whose presence in basements was less likely to draw suspicion from the Jewish police who patrolled on behalf of the Germans. One of these operators was a woman named Leah, barely 19 years old, who had worked in a telegraph office before the war. Her speed and accuracy were extraordinary. She could receive and transmit messages faster than anyone else in the network, her fingers dancing across the wire connections with practiced precision. Leah's building on Naluki Street became a crucial hub, a relay point where messages from one section of the ghetto could be transmitted to another. Jacob would visit the different nodes of the network regularly, checking connections, replacing worn sections of wire, training new operators. These visits were incredibly risky. The Germans had instituted rules about movement within the ghetto, required passes, random checkpoints, arbitrary violence against anyone who seemed suspicious. But Jacob moved through the streets with a toolbox, pretending to be doing electrical repairs for the Judenrat, the Jewish council that administered the ghetto under German supervision. Most of the German guards couldn't tell the difference between legitimate electrical work and his clandestine network maintenance. During one of these visits to Leah's station, Jacob witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young mother had come to the building, desperate for information about her husband, who had been taken during a work detail 3 days earlier. Leah tapped out an inquiry through the network, sending the message to contacts who might have information about deportations and work camps. The response came back within 10 minutes. The husband had been loaded onto a train bound for Treblinka. He was already dead, almost certainly, though no one said this explicitly to the young mother. Jacob watched as Leah gently translated the coded response, watched as the hope drained from the young woman's face, watched as she thanked Leah with quiet dignity before walking away to find her children and tell them their father wouldn't be coming home. This was what the wire system carried, Jacob realized. Not just warnings and logistical information, but grief, loss, the steady accumulation of unbearable knowledge about the fate of their people. The winter of early 1943 was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and fuel for heating was virtually non-existent in the ghetto. People burned furniture, books, anything that would provide even a few minutes of warmth. Jacob's wire system developed problems as the cold caused connections to contract and sometimes break. He spent hours in freezing basements, his numb fingers struggling to repair breaks, to maintain the network that had become so crucial to survival. During one particularly cold night in January, Jacob was working on a connection in a basement on Gessia Street when he heard voices above, German voices, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of soldiers. He froze, his hand still on the wire connection, knowing that if they found him here with the tools and wire, they would execute him on the spot. The Jewish police accompanying the Germans were searching for hiding places, for people who had avoided registration, for anyone who might be concealing weapons or contraband. Jacob heard them moving through the building above, heard doors being kicked in, heard shouting and crying. He pressed himself into the darkest corner of the basement, behind a pile of rubble, barely breathing. The footsteps came down the basement stairs. A flashlight beam swept across the space. Jacob could see the wire running along the wall just inches from where the beam was searching. If they followed the wire, if they wondered why there was copper wire running through an abandoned basement, the entire network would be compromised. But luck or perhaps divine intervention, as Jacob would sometimes think later, saved him that night. One of the soldiers called down to the one searching the basement, telling him they had found what they were looking for in an apartment upstairs. The beam moved away. The footsteps retreated up the stairs. Jacob waited in the darkness for over an hour before he dared to move, his body shaking not just from cold, but from the knowledge of how close he had come to death, and how close the entire network had come to discovery. These near misses became more frequent as the winter progressed. The Germans were intensifying their control of the ghetto, preparing for what would become the final liquidation. But they didn't know about the wire system, couldn't understand how information was spreading so quickly despite their efforts to control communication. This made them frustrated, more brutal, more unpredictable in their violence. The wire system saved hundreds of lives during these months. When the Germans announced a registration that was actually a selection for deportation, word spread through the network and people stayed away. When they cordoned off a section of the ghetto for a mass roundup, the wire carried warnings that allowed people to hide or escape before the trap closed. When they confiscated food supplies, the network helped coordinate black market distributions to ensure the most vulnerable, especially children, received at least some nutrition. But Jacob was building his other system in parallel, the one he thought of as his insurance policy. In the small hours of the morning, when Sarah was asleep and the others in the apartment were too exhausted to notice his movements, Jacob would work on the electrical kill switch. He tested voltages carefully, calculated the current needed, designed the system to be as quick and as certain as possible. As he told himself, he was being practical, preparing for the worst, making sure that if the choice came down to a quick death or the horrors of the camps, he could offer his daughter and the others a merciful alternative. But deep down, Jacob knew this was more than practicality. It was his way of maintaining some illusion of control in a situation where all control had been stripped away. The Nazis had taken everything from them, their homes, their livelihoods, their freedom, their dignity, their loved ones. But this final choice about when and how to die, this Jacob could still control. Or so he told himself as he worked on connections that would carry not messages of hope, but the voltage of death. Esther discovered what he was doing one night in February. She had come down to the basement to retrieve some hidden food supplies and found Jacob testing the electrical connections with his makeshift voltmeter. She watched him for several minutes before speaking, understanding immediately what she was seeing. "You're building a way out," she said quietly, "for when the time comes." Jacob didn't deny it. "Yes," he said simply. Esther sat down on a piece of rubble, her thin frame seeming to shrink even smaller in the dim light. "I have thought about it too," she admitted. "My children, the ones I sent away, I don't know if they're alive. I don't know if I'll ever see them again. And I think about them being taken, about what might be done to them, and I understand why a parent would want to spare their child from that. I understand why you're building this." Jacob put down his tools and looked at her. "But you think it's wrong?" Esther was quiet for a long moment. "I think it's human," she said finally. "I think it's the response of a loving father in impossible circumstances. But I also think that every moment we choose to live, even in these conditions, even with all the suffering, is an act of defiance against them. They want us dead. Every breath we take against their will is a victory, small as it may be." Jacob nodded slowly. "And if they come for the children, if they come to take Sarah to Treblinka, what then? Is it still defiance to let her be taken, to let her die in their gas chambers surrounded by strangers and terror?" Esther had no answer to that. No one did. It was the impossible question that haunted every parent in the ghetto, the calculation that could not be made, the choice that should never have to be faced. She simply put her hand on Jacob's shoulder for a moment before leaving the basement, and Jakob returned to his work on the system he hoped he would never have to use. The messages they sent were vital. Warning of impending selections, information about food distributions, news from the outside world that had been smuggled in, the location of hiding places, the movements of particularly brutal guards. When the Germans decided to clear a building, word could spread through the wire network in minutes instead of hours. Lives were saved because people had time to hide, to prepare, to move to safer locations if such a thing existed. The types of messages that flowed through the wire system evolved over time, reflecting the changing circumstances in the ghetto. In the early months, the messages were mostly practical. Food distributions, work assignments, warnings about particularly violent guards. But as the winter deepened and the deportations intensified, the messages took on a different character. They became more urgent, more desperate, more focused on survival in its most basic form. One category of messages was particularly heartbreaking. These were inquiries about missing loved ones. A wife looking for her husband who had been taken during a work detail. A mother searching for her daughter who had disappeared during a selection. A child trying to find parents who had been separated during a transport. Moshe handled many of these inquiries personally, tapping out the questions through the network, hoping someone, somewhere in the connected buildings, might have information. Sometimes the answers were positive. A man had been seen in a labor camp outside the ghetto. A woman was hiding in an attic on Zamenhof Street. A child had been smuggled to the Aryan side by a sympathetic Polish woman. These small victories, these moments of reconnection, gave people hope that perhaps not all was lost, that perhaps their loved ones had survived. But more often the answers were devastating. The transport had gone to Treblinka. The person had been shot during a selection. They had died of typhus in the overcrowded apartments. No one had seen them since the last roundup. Jakob watched Moshe deliver these messages, watched him translate the code taps into terrible truths, watched him maintain his composure even as he was breaking hearts with every word. Another crucial function of the wire system was the transmission of news from outside the ghetto. There were people, brave people, who managed to smuggle newspapers or information from the Aryan side of Warsaw, or who had contacts among sympathetic Poles who shared information about the broader war. This news was vital for maintaining morale, for understanding that the war was larger than their immediate suffering, that there were forces fighting against the Nazis, that perhaps someday this nightmare would end. The news was often grim. The German advances in Russia, the fall of cities across Europe, the systematic deportation and murder of Jewish communities in country after country. But there were also glimmers of hope, the Allied bombing of German cities, the resistance movements in various occupied countries, the growing Allied strength in North Africa. These pieces of information would be tapped out through the wire network, spreading from building to building, giving people something to hold on to beyond their immediate terror. Jakob remembered one particular message that came through in late February. It was information about the battle at Stalingrad, about how the German Sixth Army had been defeated, surrounded, and forced to surrender. This news spread through the ghetto like wildfire, carried by the wire system to every connected building. For days afterward, Jakob saw something in people's faces that had been absent for months. Hope. If the Germans could be defeated at Stalingrad, perhaps they could be defeated elsewhere. Perhaps the war would not last forever. Perhaps some of them would survive to see liberation. The resistance movement that was forming in the ghetto relied heavily on Jakob's wire system for coordination. They needed to communicate about weapons caches, about training sessions, about plans for defending different sectors. The wire system allowed them to coordinate across distances that would have been impossible to cross safely in person, given the constant German patrols and the network of informers that the Nazis had cultivated within the ghetto. Mordecai Anielewicz began using the system extensively by March. He would send coded messages about meeting locations, about the arrival of smuggled weapons, about which buildings had strong positions for defense. The wire became the nervous system of the emerging resistance, allowing different groups to function as a coordinated whole rather than isolated cells that could be picked off one by one. Jakob found himself increasingly pulled into the resistance planning. His technical knowledge was invaluable, not just for maintaining the communication system, but for understanding the electrical and structural systems of the buildings they would defend. He helped identify which buildings had good fields of fire, which had strong walls that could withstand initial assaults, which had basement connections that could serve as escape routes or supply lines. During one planning session, in a bunker beneath a building on Franciscanska Street, Jakob met the full leadership of the resistance for the first time. They were mostly young people, impossibly young to be planning an armed uprising. Mordecai was 24. Xavier Lubetkin, one of the key organizers, was 26. Marek Edelman, who commanded one of the sectors, was barely 20. But they had the bearing of seasoned soldiers, hardened by months of impossible decisions and the knowledge that they were planning what was essentially a suicide mission. Mordecai spread a hand-drawn map across the table. "These are our strong points," he said, marking several locations. "We have some weapons here, here, and here. Not enough, never enough, but something. Your wire system connects all of these locations. When we rise up, we need to coordinate our attacks. Hit them simultaneously in multiple locations. Make them think we're stronger than we are. Force them to commit significant forces rather than just sending a few guards to round us up like cattle." Jakob studied the map, seeing his wire system marked in dotted lines, connecting the various buildings. "I can have operators at each location," he said. "They can relay orders, report German positions, coordinate defensive efforts. But you understand that once the fighting starts, the wire system might not last long. If buildings burn, if connections are severed, parts of the network will go dark." Mordecai nodded. "We understand. We're not expecting miracles. We're expecting to die. But we're going to die fighting, and every minute we hold out, every German soldier we tie down here is one less soldier they can send to murder Jews somewhere else. Your wire system gives us a chance to hold out longer, to fight more effectively. That's all we can ask." The meeting lasted several hours, planning defensive positions, discussing how to ration their limited ammunition, debating whether to engage in direct combat or rely on guerrilla tactics. Jakob listened, contributed technical advice, and felt the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These young people were preparing to die, accepting it with a calm determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking, and his wire system would help them do it more effectively. But there was still the other system, the one hidden behind loose bricks and in basement corners, the electrical kill switch that could end everything in seconds. Jakob hadn't told Mordecai about it, hadn't told any of the resistance leadership. It was his private burden, his personal insurance policy. He continued to work on it even as he helped plan the uprising, testing connections, ensuring the voltage would be sufficient, marking the locations where the switches could be activated. David helped him with some of this work, though even David didn't know the full extent of what Jakob was building. One evening, they were installing a particularly complex junction in a basement on Mila Street when David asked quietly, "Why do you need so much voltage for this section? The communication system works on much lower power." Jakob was silent for a moment, his hands continuing their work. "Sometimes we need options," he said finally. "Sometimes there are worse things than death." David understood then, at least partially. He didn't say anything more, just continued helping with the installation, but Jakob could sense the younger man's troubled thoughts. David was only 22, not much younger than the resistance leaders, but he still had hope that somehow, some way, they might survive this. Jakob, at 34, and having already lost so much, had fewer illusions about their chances. Jakob remembered the first time the system truly proved its worth. It was late January, during one of the worst cold snaps. The temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius, and people were dying not just from starvation, but from the cold. The Germans had announced a food distribution at the Umschlagplatz, the assembly point. But Moshe, who still had contacts among the Jewish police, received a warning. It wasn't a food distribution, it was a trap, a selection for deportation. Moshe tapped out the warning on the wire system, and it spread through the network like electricity. Thousands of people who would have gone to the Umschlagplatz stayed away. The Germans were furious, but they couldn't understand how the information had spread so quickly without any visible signs of communication. But there was a darker purpose to Jakob's wire trick, one he never spoke about, one he barely acknowledged to himself. The same copper wire that carried messages of hope and warning could carry something else entirely. Jakob had been designing a second system in parallel with the first, and this one had nothing to do with communication. This one was about survival of a different kind, a final option when all other options were gone. David was the first to notice something odd about Jakob's work. One night in early March, he found Jakob in the basement, working on a section of wire that seemed to serve no purpose for the communication network. It ran from the main electrical junction, which still received sporadic power from the city grid, through a complex series of connections and resistors that Jakob had salvaged and hidden. David watched as Jakob carefully insulated each connection, tested the voltage with makeshift tools, and made notes in tiny handwriting on scraps of paper that he immediately burned. "What are you building, Jakob?" David asked quietly. Jakob didn't look up from his work. "Insurance," he said simply. David didn't press, but he understood. Everyone in the ghetto understood that there were fates worse than death. The stories that came back from Treblinka, from the other camps, spoke of horrors that made a quick end seem merciful. Jakob was building a way out, a final escape if escape became impossible. The electrical kill switch, as Jakob thought of it in his mind, was hidden in 3 locations. The main junction was in the basement of the building on Mila Street. The secondary was in a tunnel system that ran beneath Zamenhof Street. The third was in an attic space above Muranowski Square. Each location was wired to the same source, the city's electrical grid, which the Germans kept partially operational to power their administrative buildings and guard posts. Jakob had created a system where, with a simple connection, he could electrify sections of wire throughout the buildings in the network. The voltage would be lethal. It would be quick. He never told Rachel about this system before she died. He never told Sarah. He hoped he would never need to use it. But as the winter turned to spring and the deportations intensified, as the rumors about the death camps became impossible to deny, Jakob found himself checking the connections more frequently, making sure the system was ready. Esther was the only one Jakob told about the true purpose of the secondary system. She was tapping out a message one evening in April when she noticed Jakob installing a switch behind a loose brick in the wall. She was sharp, Esther. She had survived this long by paying attention, by understanding what people weren't saying as much as what they were. She watched Jakob work for several minutes before she spoke. "It's for the children, isn't it?" she said quietly, "so they don't have to go on the trains." Jakob's hands stopped moving. He stood very still, his back to her. "Yes," he said finally. His voice was barely a whisper. "If it comes to that. If there's no other way." Esther nodded slowly. She had 2 children of her own, hidden with a Polish family outside the ghetto, or so she hoped. She hadn't seen them in 8 months. She didn't know if they were still alive. "I understand," she said. "May God forgive us all for what this war has made us consider." The spring of 1943 brought change to the ghetto. The resistance was organizing, no longer content to simply survive. They were preparing to fight. Jakob's communication network became crucial to these efforts. Messages about weapon caches, about planned actions, about coordinating different resistance groups all flowed through the copper wires Jakob had strung through the buildings. He found himself at the center of something much larger than his simple trick with wire. Mordecai Anielewicz, the young commander of the Jewish fighting organization, met with Jakob in a basement bunker in mid-April. Mordecai was only 24, but he had the bearing of someone much older, hardened by responsibility and the knowledge of what they were facing. He studied Jakob's wire system with appreciation. "This network of yours," Mordecai said, running his finger along a wire connection, "it's given us an advantage they didn't expect. When we rise up, we need to be able to coordinate. Your wires will carry the signal to begin." Jakob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're certain about this, about fighting?" Mordecai looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "We're certain we're going to die, Jakob. The only question is how, on our feet with weapons in our hands, or on our knees in the gas chambers at Treblinka. I choose to die fighting. Your wire system means more of us can fight together, can strike at the same time, can make them pay a price for every building, every room, every life." Jakob thought about his other system, the one that hummed with lethal voltage behind the walls. He thought about Sarah, sleeping upstairs, growing thinner every day, despite his best efforts to find food for her. He thought about Rachel, taken from him without even a chance to say goodbye. He nodded slowly. "When you need it, the system will be ready." The uprising began on April 19th, the eve of Passover. The signal went through Jakob's wire system at dawn. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, the code for begin. Across the ghetto, resistance fighters emerged from hiding places, weapons in hand. They attacked German troops who had entered the ghetto expecting another easy deportation action. Instead, they were met with gunfire, with grenades made from stolen explosives, with Molotov cocktails thrown from rooftops. The shocked German forces retreated, their first retreat from Jews during the entire war. Jakob had been awake all night, knowing what was coming. He had Sarah secured in the deepest bunker, along with several other children and the elderly who couldn't fight. He had checked every connection in the wire network one last time, had made sure each operator knew their position and their codes. When he tapped out the signal to begin, his hand was steady, but his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The first reports came back within minutes. Sector 1 engaging enemy forces on Naluki Street. Sector 3 has thrown back initial assault on Zamenhof Street. Sector 5 requests ammunition resupply. Jakob relayed these messages, coordinating the responses, watching the battle unfold through the dots and dashes tapped on copper wire. From his position in the building on Mila Street, Jakob could hear the gunfire, could see the smoke rising from other parts of the ghetto. The sound of explosions rolled across the cramped streets like thunder. He saw German soldiers running, actually running away from Jewish fighters, and for a moment he felt something he had almost forgotten: pride. They were fighting back. After years of persecution, of being herded and murdered like animals, they were finally fighting back. The first day was a victory beyond anyone's expectations. The Germans retreated from the ghetto entirely, unable to cope with organized resistance when they had expected only terrified compliance. The wire system was crucial to this success, allowing the different resistance groups to coordinate their attacks, to reinforce weak points, to concentrate fire on German formations. Messages flew back and forth through the network. German tank approaching from the south. All units prepare anti-tank positions. Sniper on Zamenhof Street neutralized. Need medical supplies at Muranovska bunker. The wire hummed with the urgent communications of war. That night, there was a brief moment of celebration in the bunkers. They had survived the first day. They had driven the Germans out. It seemed impossible, miraculous even. Mordecai visited Jacob's position, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat, a captured German rifle slung over his shoulder. "Your wire system saved lives today," Mordecai said, gripping Jacob's shoulder. "We could coordinate because of you. We could fight as an army, not just as desperate individuals." "Thank you." Jacob felt tears burning in his eyes. "We're not done yet," he said. "They'll be back, with more troops, more weapons." Mordecai nodded. "I know, but we had today. We had this one day where we stood up and fought and won. Whatever comes next, they can't take that away from us." The second day, the Germans returned with reinforcements, not just the SS and police units that had been trying to clear the ghetto, but regular army troops with heavier weapons. They began systematically attacking the strong points, using artillery and flamethrowers. The wire system continued to function, though Jacob could hear the stress in the operators' taps, could sense the growing desperation as positions were overrun or abandoned. By the third day, the Germans had changed tactics entirely. They weren't trying to fight the resistance anymore. They were burning the ghetto to the ground, building by building, block by block. Flamethrowers turned apartments into infernos. Artillery reduced structures to rubble. The resistance fighters retreated into bunkers, into the sewers, continuing to fight but increasingly isolated as the infrastructure around them was destroyed. Jacob's wire system began failing as fires consumed the buildings, connections burned through. Operators were forced to abandon their positions. The network that had covered the entire ghetto was reduced to scattered fragments, isolated buildings that could no longer communicate with each other. Jacob worked frantically to maintain what he could, running through smoke-filled basements, reconnecting severed wires, but it was like trying to stop a flood with his bare hands. On the fourth day, the building next to Jacob's position collapsed after a sustained artillery barrage. The blast wave threw Jacob against a wall, stunning him. When he recovered, he found that the main trunk line of his communication system had been severed. He spent hours trying to find a way to reroute the connection, crawling through rubble and fire, but it was hopeless. The network was broken, irreparably damaged. He made his way back to his bunker on Mila Street, exhausted and despairing. The communication system that had taken months to build, that had saved so many lives, that had made the uprising possible, was gone. Destroyed in a matter of days by German brutality and overwhelming firepower. He found Sarah in the bunker, huddled with the other children, their eyes wide with fear as the sounds of battle raged above. "Papa," she said when she saw him, her small voice barely audible over the noise. "Is it over? Are we safe now?" Jacob gathered her into his arms, feeling how thin she had become, how fragile. "Not yet, sweetheart," he said. "But we're still here. We're still alive. That's what matters." But even as he said it, Jacob could feel the weight of the decision that was coming. The building was surrounded. The Germans were systematically burning every structure. The wire communication system was destroyed, but the other system, the electrical kill switch, was still functional. It ran on a different circuit, drew power from a different source. It was intact, ready, waiting for the moment when there were no other options left. The fighting continued for days, then weeks. The resistance had prepared bunkers throughout the ghetto, hidden refugees, stocked with whatever supplies they had been able to gather. These bunkers became the last bastions of resistance, holding out even as the entire ghetto burned around them. The Germans used dogs to sniff out the bunkers, used listening devices to detect sounds of life, systematically hunted down every last pocket of resistance. Jakob's bunker on Mila Street was one of the larger ones, housing over 30 people. They had food for perhaps another week, water for a few days longer if they were careful. The children were quiet, too frightened or too weak to cry. The adults took turns at the hidden ventilation shafts, watching for German patrols, listening for the sounds of searching soldiers. It was during this time, trapped in the bunker with death closing in from all sides, that Jakob told Moshe about the electrical kill switch. They were sitting in a corner, speaking in whispers so the others couldn't hear. The air was thick with smoke that seeped down even into the deep bunker. Jakob's hands were shaking as he explained what he had built, where the switches were located, how they worked. "It's for the children," Jakob said, "so they don't have to experience what happens in the camps, so their last moments are here, with people who love them, not in some cattle car or gas chamber surrounded by strangers and terror." Moshe listened without judgment, his face grave but understanding. "You've thought about this a lot," he said finally. "Every day since I built it," Jakob admitted. "Every night I lie awake wondering if I'm a monster for even considering it, or if I'm a monster for not having done it already, for letting these children suffer another day of fear and hunger and despair." Moshe put his hand on Jakob's shoulder. "You're not a monster. You're a father trying to protect his child in circumstances that should never exist. But Jakob, listen to me. The moment you throw that switch, the moment you make that choice, you become what they want us to be. You become someone who believes Jewish lives are worthless, expendable, better off dead. That's their belief, not ours. They've already taken so much from us. Don't let them take our humanity too." Jakob felt tears streaming down his face. "Then what do I do? What do I do when they break into this bunker with their dogs and their guns? When they drag Sarah away to put her on a train to Treblinka? What do I do then?" Moshe's own eyes were wet. "Then we fight. We fight to the last breath, to the last second. We fight so that even if we die as human beings who chose to live until we couldn't anymore, not as people who gave up and surrendered to despair. That's the real resistance, Jakob. Not the guns or the grenades or even your wire system. The real resistance is choosing to live, choosing to hope, choosing to believe that life is worth fighting for, even when everything suggests otherwise." But the Germans returned with reinforcements, with tanks, with flamethrowers. They began systematically burning the ghetto building by building. The resistance fighters retreated into bunkers, into the sewers, continuing to fight but slowly being overwhelmed by superior firepower and the deliberate destruction of every structure. Jakob's wire system remained operational longer than it had any right to, the wires somehow surviving even as buildings collapsed around them, but eventually sections began to fail as fires consumed the infrastructure. On the 5th day of the uprising, Jakob's building on Mila Street came under direct attack. German soldiers with flamethrowers were moving down the street, setting every building ablaze. Jakob gathered Sarah and the others who remained in the apartment. Moshe was there, and Esther and David, along with a dozen others, including 3 other children. They retreated to the basement, to the bunker Jakob had prepared. "We can't stay here," Moshe said, coughing from the smoke that was already seeping through the ceiling. "The whole building will burn." Jakob looked at the faces around him. They were beyond exhausted, beyond terror. They were in a place where the human spirit meets its absolute limit. He thought about the sewers, about trying to flee through the tunnels, but he knew the Germans were flooding them, or waiting at the exits with machine guns. He thought about surrender, but he knew what that meant. Treblinka, the gas chambers, a death designed to rob them of every last shred of dignity. He thought about his insurance policy. The electrified wires that ran through this very bunker, one switch, one connection, and it would all be over in seconds. No trains, no camps, no gas chambers, just a quick end, merciful in its swiftness if not in its necessity. Jacob moved toward the wall where the switch was hidden, his hand reaching for the loose brick. Sarah watched him, her 8-year-old eyes far too knowing for her age. "Papa, what are you doing?" she asked quietly. "Making sure we have a choice, sweetheart," he said softly. He pulled out the brick, revealing the switch behind it. The copper contacts gleamed in the dim light. All he had to do was close the circuit. David understood immediately. He grabbed Jacob's arm. "You don't have to do this. We can fight our way out. We can try the sewers." Jacob looked at his friend, this young man who had helped him build the wire system, who had risked his life climbing through dangerous spaces to install connections. "I won't let them take the children to those places," Jacob said. "I won't let them turn our deaths into part of their machinery of murder. This way, we choose. We die as human beings making a choice, not as cattle being led to slaughter." Esther spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If we do this, Jacob, if we close that switch, we become the very thing we've been fighting against. We become people who kill children, even if they're our own children. Even if we think we're being merciful." Jacob's hand trembled on the switch. The smoke was getting thicker. They could hear German voices above, the roar of flames consuming the building. He looked at Sarah, at her small face streaked with dirt and tears, and he saw Rachel in her features. What would Rachel want him to do? What was the right choice when every choice was impossible? Moshe moved closer. "Jacob," he said quietly, "your wire system, the one that sends messages, is any of it still working?" Jacob looked up, confused by the question. "Some of it, maybe. The sections that aren't burned yet." "Why?" "Because information is how we survive," Moshe said. "Even if we don't survive in body, we survive in memory and testimony. If we can get word out about what's happening here, about the uprising, about our resistance, then we survive in the history that comes after. That's the real trick with the wire, isn't it? Not the system you're holding now, but the one that connects us to the future." Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the terrible tension that had been building. He looked around at the faces in the bunker, at these people who had survived so much, who had maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Moshe was right. The real purpose of the wire system had never been about communication within the ghetto or about the terrible insurance policy he had built. It had been about connection, about refusing to be isolated, about insisting that their lives and their stories mattered. He pulled his hand away from the switch. "You're right," he said. "We fight, we try the sewers, and if we die trying to live, not choosing to surrender to death even a moment before we have to." They gathered what little they had and prepared to leave the bunker. Jacob took one last look at the switch, at the system he had built but would never use. Then he systematically disconnected the power source, ensuring that no accidental activation could occur, that the wires would carry no more current. The communication system could survive to tell their story, but the death system would end here, unused. The journey through the sewers was a nightmare of darkness, filth, and fear. They moved through tunnels filled with waste and water, their progress slow and agonizing. German soldiers were indeed waiting at several exit points, and they lost David in a firefight at one of the main junctions. He died covering their retreat, buying them precious minutes to escape. Jacob would carry that image for the rest of his life. This young man who had helped string hope through the ghetto, falling in the darkness to save others. They emerged 3 days later on the Aryan side of Warsaw, helped by Polish resistance members who were waiting at a pre-arranged location. Jacob, Sarah, Moshe, and Esther were among the few who made it out. The uprising continued for nearly a month in total, the longest Jewish resistance to the Nazis during the entire war, and it was made possible in part by Jacob's simple trick with wire, his system that had allowed coordination and communication even in the most desperate circumstances. But Jacob never spoke publicly about the other system, the one he had built as insurance, as a final option. It remained his secret, his burden to carry. Only years later, when Sarah was grown and had children of her own, did he tell her the full story of what had been behind that loose brick in the basement bunker, and why he had ultimately chosen not to use it. They survived the rest of the war, hiding in various locations around Poland, always moving, always in danger, but always holding on to the choice to keep living, to keep fighting, to keep bearing witness. Jacob's communication network became a footnote in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, mentioned in a few survivor testimonies as the wire system that helped coordinate the resistance. The engineers who studied it after the war marveled at its simplicity and effectiveness, at how a man with almost no resources had created a functioning communication network using salvaged materials. What they never learned about was the secondary system, the electrical kill switch that Jacob had built and then chosen not to use. That remained known only to those who were there in that basement, who had faced the impossible choice between a quick death by their own hand and the unknown horrors that awaited them if they were captured. It was Jacob's dark secret, the thing he had been willing to do to spare the people he loved from something worse, and the thing he had ultimately decided not to do, choosing instead to fight for every last moment of life. After the war, Jacob and Sarah eventually made their way to Palestine, later Israel. The journey took nearly 3 years, through displaced persons camps in Germany, through clandestine transport routes organized by Jewish agencies, through the British blockade of Palestine. Jacob worked as an electrical engineer again, designing systems for the new country. He never quite regained the weight he had lost during the war, and his hands never stopped their slight tremor, but he built a new life with a determined focus on connection and communication. He helped design some of the early telecommunications infrastructure for Israel, always insisting that communication was the foundation of community, that isolation was the first tool of oppression. The early years in Palestine were difficult. Jacob and Sarah lived in a tent city near Haifa for the first 6 months, along with hundreds of other survivors. The British were still restricting Jewish immigration, and the growing tensions between Jewish and Arab populations made every day uncertain. But Jacob found work quickly. His skills were desperately needed in the building of the new state, and his experience with improvised communication systems during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising proved invaluable. He rarely spoke about the war during those first years. When other survivors would gather to share their stories, Jacob would listen, but remain mostly silent. He would talk about the communication system, about how they had coordinated the resistance. But he never mentioned the electrical kill switch. That secret weighed on him like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing year rather than lighter. Sarah grew up in this new country, learning Hebrew, making friends with other children of survivors. She was a serious child, marked by what she had witnessed. But she had her mother Rachel's resilience, her ability to find joy, even in difficult circumstances. She excelled in school, particularly in history and literature, drawn to subjects that helped her make sense of what she had experienced. It wasn't until Sarah was 16 in 1955 that Jacob finally told her about the electrical kill switch. They were sitting on the beach in Tel Aviv, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. Sarah had been asking more questions about the war, wanting to understand the full story of what her father had done, what he had built, what he had survived. Jacob took a deep breath and began to explain. He told her about the copper wire, about the communication system everyone knew about. And then he told her about the other system, the one hidden behind loose bricks and in basement corners, the one designed to carry lethal voltage instead of messages. He told her about the moment in the bunker when he had his hand on the switch, ready to close the circuit, ready to end all their suffering in one terrible instant. Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished. The sun had set completely, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Finally, she spoke. "Why didn't you use it?" she asked, not accusing, just genuinely curious. Jacob had thought about this question countless times over the years, because Moshe reminded me that living, continuing to live even when death seemed preferable, was itself a form of resistance. Because I realized that the moment I closed that switch, I would be doing the Nazis' work for them. Because despite everything, despite all the horror and the despair, some part of me still believed that life was worth fighting for, that you were worth fighting for, that there might be a tomorrow worth surviving to see. "Would you have done it?" Sarah asked. "If we hadn't escaped through the sewers, if the Germans had found us in the bunker, would you have thrown the switch?" Jacob looked at his daughter, at this young woman who carried so much trauma, but also so much strength. "Honestly, I don't know. I hope I would have continued to choose life, to fight until there was literally no fight left. But I can't know what I would have done in that final moment. I built the system because I wanted to have that choice, that control. But in the end, I never had to make it. We escaped. We survived. And I've spent every day since then grateful that I never had to find out what I would have chosen." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Sarah began to understand her father not just as a survivor, not just as the man who had built the communication system that helped the resistance, but as someone who had grappled with impossible moral choices, who had stood at the edge of an abyss and somehow found the strength to step back. It gave her a deeper appreciation for the complexity of survival, for the weight that survivors carried. As Sarah grew older and began her own family, she often thought about her father's story. She married a man named Eli, also a child of survivors, and they had 3 children together. Sarah became a teacher, specifically choosing to teach history because she believed that understanding the past was crucial to building a better future. She would tell her students about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, about the resistance, about the ways that people had fought back against impossible odds. But she didn't tell them about the electrical kill switch. That part of the story remained private, within the family, something too complex and too painful for casual discussion. Jacob had asked her to keep it quiet, and she respected his wish. It was only after his death in 1987 that she began to consider whether the full story needed to be told. Jacob's later years were productive but haunted. He designed communication systems for the Israeli military, for civilian infrastructure, for emergency services. He trained a generation of engineers in Israel, passing on not just technical knowledge, but a deep understanding of why communication systems mattered, how they could save lives, how they could enable coordination and resistance against oppression. His students knew him as brilliant but troubled, a man who carried shadows behind his eyes, even when he was explaining the most technical details of electrical systems. He began giving testimony about the Warsaw Ghetto in the 1960s, speaking to historians, to documentary filmmakers, to students. These testimonies were difficult for him, bringing back memories he had spent years trying to suppress. But he felt an obligation to speak, to ensure that what had happened was remembered, that the resistance was documented, that future generations understood both the horror of the Holocaust and the courage of those who had fought back. During these testimonies, Jacob would describe the wire communication system in detail. He would draw diagrams showing how the connections had been made, explain the codes they had used, discuss the technical challenges of maintaining the system under impossible conditions. Historians and engineers were fascinated by what he had accomplished with such limited resources. Several academic papers were written analyzing Jacob's improvised communication network, discussing its role in the uprising, examining it as an example of innovation under extreme pressure. But Jacob never mentioned the electrical kill switch in these official testimonies. He couldn't bring himself to admit publicly that he had built a system designed to electrocute children, even with the justification that it would have been mercy compared to the gas chambers. He feared judgment, feared being misunderstood, feared that people who hadn't been there couldn't comprehend the impossible calculations that survival in the ghetto had required. Moshe, who had settled in New York after the war, understood Yakob's silence. They corresponded regularly, long letters crossing the Atlantic, sharing memories and reflections. In one letter from 1972, Moshe wrote, "The world wants simple stories, Jakob. They want heroes and villains, clear moral lines. They don't want to hear about the wire you built to kill with, only about the wire you built to communicate with. They don't want to confront the darkness that you confronted in that basement, the choice you almost made. But someday, perhaps, someone will be ready to hear the full story. And when they are, that story needs to be told, because it's part of the truth of what happened to us." Esther's death in 1948, during Israel's War of Independence, affected Jacob deeply. She had been one of the few people who knew about the electrical kill switch, one of the few who had understood what he had been preparing to do in those terrible days in the ghetto. Her death felt like the loss of a witness, someone who could validate his experience, who could confirm that yes, these impossible choices had existed, that no, he wasn't insane for having built such a system. Sarah grew up, married, had children of her own. She became a teacher, specializing in history, making sure that the stories of the Holocaust were told and retold, that the lessons were never forgotten. She often thought about her father's wire system, about the messages that had flowed through those simple copper lines, about the lives that had been saved because people could communicate, coordinate, resist together rather than being picked off in isolation. Jakob lived until 1987, dying at the age of 79. In his final years, he began to speak more openly about his experiences during the war, participating in oral history projects, talking to students, making sure the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was remembered. But he never spoke in detail about the secondary system, about the electrical kill switch. That story he told only to Sarah in private, when she was old enough to understand the impossible moral calculus of survival in impossible circumstances. It was Sarah who, years after her father's death, finally revealed the full story in a memoir she published in 2003. She wrote about the wire communication system that had helped coordinate the uprising, and she wrote about the other system, the one her father had built but never used, the system designed to offer a quick death rather than a slow one, an escape from the trains that led to Treblinka and Auschwitz. She wrote about the moment in the basement when her father had his hand on the switch, ready to close the circuit, and about the conversation that had convinced him to try for life instead of choosing death. Writing the memoir took Sarah nearly 5 years. She conducted extensive research, interviewing other survivors, reading historical documents, trying to place her father's story within the broader context of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She spoke with historians who specialized in the Holocaust, with ethicists who studied moral decision-making in extreme circumstances, with other children of survivors who had their own complex relationships with their parents' wartime experiences. The decision to include the details about the electrical kill switch was agonizing for Sarah. She knew that revealing this aspect of her father's story would provoke controversy, would open him up to posthumous judgment, would force conversations that many people would find uncomfortable. But she also believed that the full truth needed to be told, that sanitizing the story by leaving out its darkest elements would be a disservice to history and to her father's memory. She wrote multiple drafts of the section about the kill switch, trying to find the right balance between honesty and context, between describing what her father had built and explaining why he had built it. She wanted readers to understand the impossible moral landscape of the ghetto, the way that normal ethical frameworks collapsed under the weight of systematic genocide, the love that drove a father to consider such a terrible action. When the memoir was finally published in Hebrew in 2003, the reaction was immediate and intense. The Israeli press seized on the story of the electrical kill switch, with headlines that alternately condemned and defended Yaqub's actions. Some called it a revelation of the true depths of Holocaust suffering, evidence of how Nazi persecution had driven people to contemplate the unthinkable. Others called it evidence of moral collapse, a surrender to evil that should be condemned even while understanding the circumstances that produced it. The debate spilled over into survivor communities, into synagogues, into academic conferences. Some survivors spoke up to defend Yaqub, to say that yes, they too had contemplated similar actions, that the choice between a quick death and the horrors of the camps was one that many people had faced in various forms. Others were horrified, arguing that nothing, no circumstance, no matter how dire, justified planning to kill children, even one's own children. The ethical dimensions of the story became a subject of intense academic interest. Philosophy departments held seminars, examining Yaqub's case as an example of moral decision-making in extremis. What did it mean to choose death over life? Was Yaqub's decision to build the kill switch a moral failure, or was it an expression of love and agency in a context where both had been systematically stripped away? And most importantly, did his decision not to use it redeem the act of building it, or was the very construction of such a system inexcusable regardless of whether it was ultimately employed? Rabbi David Kahane, who had survived the Holocaust by hiding in the sewers of Lvov, wrote a series of essays in response to Sarah's memoir. These essays became influential in shaping how many people understood Yaqub's story. Rabbi Kahane argued that the Holocaust had created moral situations that exceeded normal human frameworks for judgment. The Nazis, he wrote, had succeeded in creating circumstances where every choice was terrible, where love itself became twisted into something painful and destructive. Rabbi Kahane drew on Jewish theological traditions about martyrdom, about the concept of Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name through death when forced to violate fundamental commandments. But he also discussed the competing value of Pikuach Nefesh, the preservation of life, which in Jewish law takes precedence over almost everything else. Yaqub's dilemma, Rabbi Kahane argued, was that he faced a situation where these two fundamental principles seemed to be in direct conflict. Preserving life by allowing his daughter to live, even if that meant suffering in the camps, or preventing suffering by ending her life quickly before the Germans could take her. The debate wasn't limited to Jewish communities or Holocaust scholars. The story resonated more broadly, touching on contemporary discussions about euthanasia, end-of-life decisions, and parental rights and responsibilities. Medical ethicists used Yaqub's case to discuss decision-making in impossible circumstances. Lawyers debated whether his actions, if carried out, would have constituted murder or mercy killing. Psychologists examined the trauma that survivors carried, the weight of decisions made and not made under extreme duress. Hannah Levinson's response to Sarah's memoir represented a different perspective within survivor communities. Levinson had survived Auschwitz and had become a prominent voice in Holocaust education. She acknowledged the impossible circumstances that Yaqub had faced, but she argued forcefully that building the kill switch represented a moral line that should not have been crossed. In her view, every moment that Yaqub spent constructing that system was a moment when he was accepting Nazi premises about the worthlessness of Jewish life, when he was internalizing the idea that death was preferable to continued existence as a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe. Levinson wrote, "I understand the love that motivated Yaqub. I understand the desire to spare one's child from suffering. But the Nazis wanted us to believe that we were better off dead, that Jewish existence was unbearable, that we should cooperate in our own destruction. Every time we resisted that narrative, every time we chose life despite the suffering, we won a victory against them. Jacob's wire communication system represented that resistance. His electrical kill switch represented its opposite, a surrender to the Nazi worldview that we should all be dead. The debate between these perspectives continued for years after the memoir's publication. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions, speaking at conferences, participating in panel discussions, defending her decision to reveal the full story. She emphasized repeatedly that her goal was not to judge her father, but to present the complexity of survival, to show the impossible choices that people faced, to prevent the Holocaust from being simplified into comfortable narratives about heroic resistance and clear moral choices. The international response, when the book was translated into English in 2004, brought new dimensions to the conversation. Survivors in America and Europe added their own testimonies, their own stories of impossible choices. Some spoke publicly for the first time about having contemplated similar actions, about having obtained poison or weapons or made other preparations for a final escape if capture became inevitable. These testimonies, which had been kept private for decades, emerged in response to Sarah's memoir, as if her courage in revealing her father's story had given permission for others to speak their own difficult truths. One particularly powerful testimony came from a woman named Ruth Feldman, who had survived Auschwitz. She revealed that her father, a doctor in the Lodz ghetto, had obtained a supply of morphine and had planned to use it to give his family a peaceful death if deportation became inevitable. He never used it. They were hidden by Polish friends and survived. But Ruth had discovered the morphine after the war and had carried the knowledge of what her father had planned for over 50 years before speaking about it publicly. These revelations sparked another wave of discussion about how much of the Holocaust experience remained untold, how many survivors carried similar secrets, how many families had faced comparable dilemmas. It forced a reckoning with the complexity of survival, with the fact that resistance took many forms, and that people navigated impossible moral territories in ways that couldn't be reduced to simple judgments about right and wrong. The technical aspects of Jacob's wire systems also received renewed attention after the memoir's publication. Engineers and historians collaborated on papers examining what Jacob had built, analyzing the communication system in detail, and, more cautiously, discussing the electrical kill switch from a technical standpoint. These analyses revealed the sophistication of Jacob's designs, the way he had used limited resources to maximum effect, the ingenuity required to create functioning systems under such constraints. One engineer who studied Jacob's work noted that the kill switch system, while morally troubling, demonstrated the same engineering brilliance as the communication system. Jacob had designed it to be reliable, to function even after months without maintenance, to deliver lethal voltage quickly and certainly. This attention to detail, the engineer wrote, revealed something about Jacob's state of mind. He was preparing for the worst possible scenario, with the same careful planning he brought to everything else, treating it as a problem to be solved even though the solution was terrible. Sarah's grandchildren, growing up with this story as part of their family history, had their own perspectives on what Jacob had done. They were several generations removed from the Holocaust, growing up in an Israel that was strong and secure, at least relative to the desperate vulnerability of the Warsaw Ghetto. For them, their great-grandfather was a figure from history, someone whose experiences seemed almost incomprehensible in their extremity. But they were proud of him, proud of the resistance he had helped coordinate, and they tried to understand the darkness of the kill switch without judging too harshly actions taken in circumstances they could barely imagine. The memoir also prompted discussions about how Holocaust memory was evolving as the generation of survivors aged and died. By 2003, survivors were in their 70s and 80s, and their children, the so-called second generation, were taking on increasing responsibility for Holocaust education and remembrance. Sarah's decision to reveal the full story of her father's wire systems, including its darkest aspects, was part of this generational transition. A recognition that as direct witnesses disappeared, the need for complex, honest history became even more important. But Sarah's point in revealing the story was not to judge her father, or to resolve the moral questions his actions raised. Her point was to illustrate the impossible situations the Nazis created, the way they twisted normal human morality into knots, the way they forced people to consider actions that would be unthinkable in any other context. Her father's wire trick, both the communication system and the electrical kill switch, represented the full spectrum of human response to genocide. From the determination to resist and communicate and maintain connection to the ultimate despair that contemplates choosing death over whatever horrors might come. The story of Jakob's wire system became part of Holocaust education, taught in schools alongside the broader history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Students learned about the practical resistance, the way Jewish fighters had used every tool and trick at their disposal to fight back against overwhelming odds. They learned about the communication network that had made coordination possible, about the messages tapped out in simple code that had saved lives and enabled resistance. And they learned, with appropriate context and discussion, about the darker side of the system, about the electrical kill switch that represented the absolute depths to which Nazi persecution had driven its victims. Moshe survived the war as well, settling in New York. He remained close to Jacob and Sarah, visiting them in Israel several times over the years. In his own testimony, recorded in the 1970s for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, he spoke about Jacob's ingenuity, about the wire system that had seemed like such a simple trick, but had proven so crucial. He also spoke briefly about the moment in the basement, about the conversation that had convinced Jacob to disconnect the kill switch and choose life instead of death. The war taught us many things, Moshe said in that testimony, but perhaps the most important was that the choice to live, to keep fighting, to keep hoping even in the face of absolute evil, that choice is itself a form of resistance. Jacob's real trick wasn't the wire. It was remembering, even in the darkest moment, that our lives belonged to us, not to our murderers, and that every moment we chose to keep living was a victory they couldn't take away. Esther died in 1948, during Israel's War of Independence, killed by artillery fire while helping to evacuate children from a kibbutz under attack. Her own children, the ones she had hidden with a Polish family, survived the war and eventually joined her in Palestine, though she had less than 3 years with them before her death. In her brief time with them, she spoke often about the wire system, about Jacob's trick that had helped them survive long enough to be reunited. She never mentioned the kill switch, keeping that secret as Jacob had asked her to do, but her children learned about it later from Sarah's memoir. They understood why their mother had kept silent. Some stories are too heavy to carry alone, but too painful to share widely. Jacob had carried that burden, so others didn't have to. The technical details of Jacob's wire system were studied by military historians and communications experts after the war. What he had accomplished with salvage materials and desperate ingenuity was remarkable from an engineering standpoint. The system had used basic electrical principles, telephone switching concepts, and clever routing to create a network that could survive partial damage and continue functioning even as buildings were destroyed around it. Military communications specialists incorporated some of his techniques into their own training, teaching soldiers how to create improvised communication networks in disaster or combat situations. But the electrical kill switch system received less technical analysis and more ethical examination. Philosophers, ethicists, and theologians debated the moral implications of Jacob's creation. Was it mercy or murder to offer such an escape? Did the fact that he chose not to use it redeem the act of building it, or was the very construction of such a system a moral failure? These were questions without easy answers. Questions that highlighted the way extreme evil forces people to confront moral choices that should never exist. Rabbi David Kahan, a survivor who had hidden in the sewers of Lvov during the war, wrote extensively about Jacob's story in the 1960s and 1970s. He argued that judging people for their actions during the Holocaust required understanding the complete breakdown of normal moral frameworks that the Nazis engineered. Jacob's decision to build the kill switch, Rabbi Kahan wrote, was not the action of a murderer, but the action of a man trying to maintain some shred of agency and dignity in a system designed to strip both away. The fact that he ultimately chose not to use it, that he chose to fight for life, even in the face of almost certain death, that was the measure of his moral courage, not the fact that he had prepared for the worst possible outcome. Others disagreed. Hannah Levinson, another survivor and the author of several books on Holocaust ethics, argued that preparing to kill children, even one's own children, even to spare them from worse suffering, crossed a moral line that should never be crossed. The Nazis wanted us to be complicit in our own destruction, she wrote. Every time we considered doing their work for them, even from a place of love and desperation, we gave them a spiritual victory they didn't deserve. Jacob's wire communication system represented human ingenuity and resistance. His kill switch represented surrender to Nazi logic, the logic that Jewish lives were worthless and could be disposed of at will. That he didn't use it doesn't erase the fact that he built it. The debate continued for decades, touching on fundamental questions about morality, autonomy, mercy, and the limits of judgment. Jacob's story became a case study in ethics courses, in Holocaust education programs, in discussions about euthanasia and end-of-life choices. It raised questions that had no comfortable answers, that forced people to confront the darkest possibilities of human existence and the impossible choices that extreme evil can create. Sarah lived to see her grandchildren grow up, and to them she told stories about their great-grandfather Jacob, about his brilliance and his courage, about his wire system that had helped people resist and survive. She told them about the dark moment in the basement, about the choice he had almost made, and the choice he ultimately did make. She wanted them to understand the full complexity of survival during the Holocaust, the way it required not just physical courage, but moral courage, the courage to keep choosing life even when death might seem easier or more merciful. The copper wires that Jacob had strung through the Warsaw Ghetto were all destroyed during the uprising and the final liquidation of the ghetto in May 1943. The Germans burned everything, reducing the ghetto to rubble and ash. No physical trace of Jacob's system survived, but the memory of it persisted in testimony, in historical records, in the stories that survivors told. The wire trick lived on as a symbol of resistance, of human ingenuity in the face of oppression, of the power of communication and connection even in the darkest circumstances. And the electrical kill switch, never used but never forgotten by those who knew about it, lived on as a symbol of something else, something more troubling and profound. It represented the depths of despair to which Nazi persecution drove its victims, the way genocide attacks not just bodies but souls, forcing people to contemplate actions that would be unthinkable in any normal human context. It represented the moment when a loving father considered killing his own child to spare her from worse suffering, and the moment when that same father chose to fight for one more day of life instead. Jacob's trick with the wire, the story would be told in Jewish communities for generations, was actually two tricks, two systems, two choices about how to survive the unsurvivable. One system carried messages of hope and resistance. The other offered a final escape from unbearable suffering. One helped people live, the other would have helped them die. Jacob built both, understood both, and in the end, chose the first over the second, chose communication over silence, chose life over death, chose to fight for every last moment of human dignity and connection, even when the odds were impossible and the outcome seemed certain. The dark reason behind Jacob's wire trick was never that he wanted to kill or that he had given up hope. The dark reason was that the Nazis had created a world where a good man, a loving father, a brilliant engineer, had to seriously consider building a system to electrocute his own child rather than let her be taken to Treblinka. The dark reason was that genocide creates impossible moral choices, that it forces people to contemplate actions that should be unimaginable, that it twists love itself into something painful and terrible. But the brighter truth, the one that survivors like Moshe and Sarah emphasized whenever they told Jacob's story, was that even in that moment of ultimate darkness, even with his hand on the switch that would end everything, Jacob found a reason to choose life. He found it in Moshe's reminder that their stories mattered, that bearing witness was itself a form of resistance, that surviving to tell the truth about what happened was a way of defeating the Nazi attempt to erase them from history. He found it in Esther's quiet challenge, her insistence that they not become the very evil they were fighting. He found it in his love for Sarah, his desire to give her every possible chance at life, even if that chance seemed infinitesimally small. The story of Jacob Steinberg and his wire trick, both the communication system and the electrical kill switch, remains a powerful testament to the complexity of survival during the Holocaust. It shows both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human despair. It demonstrates how resistance took many forms, from armed uprising to the simple insistence on staying alive one more day. It illustrates the impossible moral calculations that genocide forces on its victims. And ultimately, it stands as a reminder that even in the face of absolute evil, even when every choice is terrible and every outcome seems hopeless, people can still find reasons to choose life, to choose connection, to choose the hard work of staying human in circumstances designed to destroy humanity itself. Jacob's wire carried messages through the darkness of the Warsaw Ghetto. But the most important message it carried, the one that echoes through history, is the one Jacob himself embodied in that basement on Meyler Street, when he pulled his hand away from the kill switch and chose to try for life instead. The message that life, even desperate life, even threatened life, even life that might end in horror, is still worth fighting for. The message that human connection and human dignity are worth preserving to the very last moment. The message that choosing hope over despair, even when hope seems irrational, is itself an act of resistance against those who would destroy hope entirely. No one ever told the dark reason behind Jacob's wire trick because it was too painful, too complex, too morally challenging for easy discussion. But Sarah told it finally, decades later, because she believed that understanding the full story, including its darkest elements, was necessary to truly comprehend what the Holocaust did to its victims and survivors. It wasn't enough to remember the resistance and the courage. It was also necessary to remember the despair and the impossible choices, the ways that evil forces people to contemplate actions that should be unthinkable, and the moral courage required to choose life even in those circumstances. The wire system remained in memory and in testimony as both a practical tool of resistance and a symbol of the human determination to maintain connection even in the face of systematic attempts to isolate and destroy. Jacob's trick was simple in its engineering, but profound in its implications. It showed that communication is power, that connection is resistance, that even the smallest technical innovation can have enormous moral and practical consequences in the fight against oppression. And the electrical kill switch, never used but never forgotten, remained as a reminder of how close the victims of genocide came to absolute despair. How thin the line was between choosing to live and choosing to die, and how remarkable it was that so many chose to keep fighting, keep hoping, keep surviving, even when every rational calculation suggested that death was inevitable and perhaps even preferable to the suffering that might come. Jacob Steinberg's legacy lived on in his daughter Sarah, in his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the testimony he gave and the story he told. His wire trick, both versions of it, became part of Holocaust history, studied and debated and remembered. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the choice he made in that basement, the moment when he pulled his hand away from the switch and chose to try for life one more time. That choice, repeated by thousands of Holocaust victims in countless variations, was the ultimate resistance to genocide. It was the insistence that life belonged to the living, not to the murderers, and that every moment of continued existence was a victory against those who sought to erase entire peoples from the earth. The wires are gone now, burned away with the Warsaw Ghetto itself, reduced to ash and memory. But the trick Jacob Steinberg performed with those wires, the feat of engineering and moral courage, lives on as a testament to human resilience, human ingenuity, and the complex moral landscape of survival in the face of absolute evil. His story, with all its light and darkness, remains a crucial part of the historical record, a reminder of what happened and what people did to survive it, and a challenge to future generations to ensure that such impossible choices never have to be made again.